And my question centers around the Emmett Till murder. And I've often wondered why did not Martin, Dr. King and the others get more involved with Emmett's mother in terms of trying to bring justice.
You know,
do you have an idea as to?
I don't have a definitive answer for you, sir. But you know, I think it is critical to recognize that the Emmett Till case does have a direct link in a lot of ways to the Southern Civil Rights Movement beyond simply the case itself. And the most dramatic example of this might be is that Rosa Parks is, of course, she's the secretary for the NAACP branch in Montgomery. And there's a big rally held where Mamie Till Bradley is there, and there's, you know, in the aftermath of the Till murder. And that's part of what is building the political momentum and part of what's building Rosa Parks' own developing ideology in the mid-1950s to ultimately, you know, begin the Montgomery bus boycott by refusing to give up her seat. So that's one direct link. To your question about King and Emmett Till, when the Emmett Till case breaks, right, King is still very much he's coming out of graduate school. It's not until the next year after the murder when he begins as the pastorate in Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. So it's still very much at the early part of his political career. But you ask a really interesting question, one I don't have a good answer to, and that's what happens with Mamie Till Bradley in the years after, you know, the spotlight of the Emmett Till murder. And I don't know the answer to that question, to be honest. And I think that might be the way into that. I don't have a good answer for you. But there were subsequent investigations later on, but Emmett Till kind of drifted off the radar screen for a while after the mid to late 50s. And his story wasn't really revived until the late 1970s again, particularly through the Eyes on the Prize series, which most of us know, right? That's what helped to sort of bring the Emmett Till case back into a lot of national attention by the early 80s. Thanks for the good question.
Aram, it looks like we have a question in the chat, one from David that just popped up.
Oh, I see. Did there seem to be a second phase of the slow arc of history argument versus the ceaseless agitation? I think that David's question is kind of like that's kind of a dynamic, I think, in African-American history and more generally in politics, right? About sort of this, you know, how best to bring about change. Does it happen through direct confrontation? Does it happen through gradual accommodation? And there is no one answer to that question, of course, right? The constant example I always bring up with my students in terms of, like, you know, let's work backwards. President Lyndon Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act in 1965, right? Well, what did that take? It took debate in the Senate, it took debate in the House, right? There's a legislative process, right? But it's also important to remember that Lyndon Johnson didn't have a voting rights bill on his mind until the Selma demonstrations. Okay, so the Selma demonstrations, right? And the Selma and Montgomery March that ultimately needed federal intervention and the protection for that to happen. Well, we got to backtrack from that. King getting involved in the Selma demonstrations in early 1965, the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson that leads to the idea to march to march, the involvement of clergy, the involvement of African Americans from around the country in this big mass march. But even before that, who was doing grassroots organizing for years in Selma since the Freedom Rides? Organizers from SNCC. They were doing that sort of patient grassroots organizing that built a politicized Black community. And even before that, the local people themselves, they had the Dallas County Voters League. Dallas County is the county where Selma is. And these were people who were trying to register to vote and documenting the injustice they faced and working with SNCC and building up, right? So it's the actions of local people that ultimately filtered into the national conversation. I know I'm not answering David's question directly, but I do think that this is sort of a, you know, that politics works from both the bottom up and the top down, and they're in constant discussion with each other. David, do you want to talk?
Yeah, my second question, and I said in the chat, the best questions don't have one answer. They never do. The second one was that went along with my first comment. Actually, I had a discussion because right now at my school we teach humanities instead of English and history separately. And so he just finished teaching letters of Birmingham, and I think the instructor got to get to 1964 Civil Rights Act today. So after school, we're having a discussion about how long a arc of progress it was for the Democratic Party, from Humphrey's speech about standing upright and walking in the sunshine of civil rights in the 48 Democratic Convention speech, all the way through Truman, desegregation, and the comments he made about Woodward and standing up really against people in the South who didn't expect him to make such a stand, all the way through LBJ and the 64, how long an arc that was just for the Democratic Party.
And the Democratic Party is the MFDP story sort of highlights the bubbling tensions within the Democratic Party that are going to start to fracture, because as in the 1960s, as you politicize people at the grassroots, and it starts with the civil rights movement, but it'll continue with the anti-war movement, women's movement, LGBTQ rights, all these forces that are sometimes called identity politics, but you might just say sort of the conscience Democrats. That was a term that was used by the late 60s, right? Each of these is forcing the Democratic Party to consider them, right? But the Democratic Party is also traditionally the party of sort of labor unions and big city politics, like the political bosses, and also conservative Southern Democrats, right? So it's this coalition party, and these forces from below, from the left, are forcing the party to reckon with that. So what happens is the next generation of Southern conservatives end up going Republican. Strom Thurmond is the first example of this, because he literally converts to the Republican Party in the midst of this 64. He's a pioneer in that regard. And so there's a national dimension. The actions of what's going on the ground shape the larger structures, right? And that's important to recognize. The question: can you expand on making connections or parallels to the Black Lives Matter movement? That's an interesting question. Sometimes the Black Lives Matter activists themselves say, this isn't your grandfather's civil rights movement, and they try to distance themselves from the civil rights movement, which is really fascinating, because they're in many ways reacting against the stereotype of the civil rights movement of sort of just like the people dressed as if they're going to church, following the politics of respectability, the people who are getting blasted by fire hoses and so on. But the civil rights movement, I think, as we understand it, is a much more dynamic, grassroots process that involves more radical and militant voices than we sometimes give it credit for now, because it's become sort of sanitized to some degree. So in that respect, I think you see lots of parallels, particularly the way that Black Lives Matter activists talk about identity, decision making, consensus building really shows a lot of parallels, not to King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but more to SNCC, more to groups like SNCC, which really had this faith in sort of the democratic process within their organization, the way that they would hash everything out in discussions and build consensus. Sort of that sort of messy but real belief that everyone's voice mattered within the organization to make decisions. And you see it all. The Black Lives Matter demonstrations draw directly from the tactics of the movement in terms of mass marches, in terms of the mobilizing of people on a large scale. Civil rights demonstrators were more confrontational in the 60s sometimes than we tend to think of them based on the modern images. So there's lots of parallels to be seen in that respect, I think. Patrick asked, if Dr. King had not been assassinated, how effective do you think he would have been at obtaining economic equality? That's a tough question to answer, Patrick. I do think that the political winds were drifting against King prior to his death, right? Just in terms of, like, for instance, his where he stood on sort of poll data. And for instance, King was losing some of his influence outside of Black America by 67, 68 because of his early stance against the Vietnam War, because of his policy. You remember in the last book that he wrote, Where Do We Go From Here? He's talking about providing Americans with a guaranteed national income, sort of more socialist framework to what he's saying. And we're in terms of sort of the politics of backlash that are occurring by 67, 68. More conservatives being elected in the midterm elections in 66, Richard Nixon winning election in 1968. George Wallace running as a third party candidate, reflecting some of these discontent of the white working class, which are traditionally voted Democratic, and that next generation will most likely be voting Republican. Will be Reagan Democrats by 1980. And so the Dr. King himself couldn't have reversed that political situation. That said, when King was assassinated, it injected this deep element of despair into Black political organizing in 1968. Immediately people were just proclaiming violence, nonviolent strategies is dead. The Poor People's Campaign lacked King's sort of central organizing charisma at its center, so it was very sort of dissolute in the summer of 1968. So I think, had King lived, of course, there would have been this exceptionally eloquent, powerful voice for the issue of economic injustice that would have continued. But it wouldn't have necessarily, in my opinion, or in my guess, it wouldn't have necessarily reversed the larger political drift of the nation toward a more conservative politics in the 1970s. This question, what should be the role of the white liberal in movements primarily involving race? Malcolm X was particularly against needing the help of them, right? And so, Martin Luther King here makes the distinction between those white moderates who are more interested in order than in justice, right? But also welcomes very much those white people of conscience, right? He wants to build this beloved community, right? And that involves white people. And he believes, he's inherently believes in his faith is in racial integration to the end of his life. So here we have two different viewpoints about sort of the role of whites. For King, he welcomes the white person of conscience into the movement, and that they must play a place in race. And part of King's economic agenda was, especially allying with the churches and the labor movements and those progressive organizations around the country that were oriented in the same way, and that included white people. For Malcolm X, right, toward the end of his life, he began to make distinctions between white individuals of conscience and still sort of the white man as sort of a structure, right? And he was more welcoming of that sort of white individual. He tells a story in the autobiography about how when he first met this young white woman who said, "Is there anything we can do?" And he said, "No." But then in the autobiography, he talks about how he wished he could have talked to her again and said, "There is something you can do. There are ways in which you can participate in this." So those are two sort of different visions. All right. I just tried to put together some questions that, again, you might want to. You could figure out how to think about them best in the context of your classroom. But I just tried to get documents in conversation with each other. So I have one about putting the Birmingham Manifesto with King's letter as they're sort of ideologically in line with each other and certain faith in American democratic traditions and hope. But then we could put the letter from Birmingham jail also in conversation with the letter that inspired it from the 8 clergymen. And then maybe most intriguingly, what if we read "I Have a Dream" more directly informed from the letter from a Birmingham jail? How are those two documents part of the same person, right? The idea of this is in particular to kind of complicate "I Have a Dream," to make it to think about the notes within it that aren't the notes that we most commonly just sort of be like, "Yay, Martin Luther King, racial justice." And then in thinking about race and politics in '64, we can put Humphrey and Thurman in direct conversation about the idea of rights. But then in thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer's 2 speeches that we have, it might be interesting just to think about the 2 speeches that are quite similar, the one to the mass meeting and the speech to the Democratic National Convention, just a month apart from each other, that repeat the same story about the violence, but also have different audiences. So it might help your students just thinking about in different contexts, right? Why give this particular speech in this way? Why emphasize these themes to this audience and why this one to this one? And then that last question here is a sort of about Fannie Lou Hamer questioning America, right? If the MFDP isn't seated, is she sort of on the brink? And is this maybe sort of a transition for some people into Black radicalism? On Malcolm X, put together as 2 speeches. In what ways are they consistent? And in what ways perhaps are they evolving and changing? And then finally, Malcolm calls 1964 the year of the ballot or the bullet. With the documents, why might African Americans choose the ballot? Why might they choose the bullet, right, in the more metaphorical sense? And then finally, the last one is just sort of a catch-all. What happens when you put King, Hamer, and Malcolm into the conversation about the American democratic tradition? So, I'll make sure that Brian has this PowerPoint to send out to you if you want more with these questions. The last slide is just the links to the documents that you already have, I think.
This is just a kind of general question. In your experience, have you encountered regional differences in terms of the understanding of the civil rights movement? Is there a difference in the South versus the Southwest or the Northeast in terms of what the civil rights movement was and what its accomplishments were?
That's a really interesting question, Eric. Thanks. I'm no expert on the Southwest, and of course I know, obviously in Texas, you were talking about a different, and we were alluding to this, I think, at the end of last week's session too, right? That the Texas civil rights movement is fundamentally different because it is both a black and brown movement from its beginnings, and there's alliances and distinctions within that. So I do think that that is a one interesting difference. I think there's a lot of parallels, but at the same time, the northern movement and the southern movement, many in the north are seeing the southern demonstrations, and that is what is helping to spur demonstrations in the north as well. So just as one example, in Boston, there's a massive civil rights march in 1963 in support of the Birmingham March, but it addresses Boston concerns, right? In particular, the de facto patterns of school segregation in Boston. And those issues of economic justice tend to pop up earlier in the northern demonstrations because they're not fighting legalized Jim Crow in the same way, right? So the political situation, obviously, and the makeup of the population dictates what that civil rights movement often looks like, right? In places where there's smaller black populations, in a Seattle or a Portland, for instance, in the West, there are still civil rights movements, but they might not be as galvanizing as what happens in New York around the World Fair in 1964.
Thanks, that's helpful. Aaron, what's it like teaching these issues in Memphis?
Well, it's been especially when we hit 2018, which was the 50th anniversary of King's assassination, which of course happened in Memphis, right? That got a lot of students thinking more directly about politics. We had a local controversy here over a speech of a Confederate general, Nathan Bedford Forrest, that was in the middle of the city, and it ultimately came down right before right before the 50th anniversary, because we had all this national media that was going to come here. And then, of course, there was the same Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Memphis that occurred throughout the nation, right? Particularly in 2020. And so Memphis is a Black majority city. Roughly 60% of the city itself at this point is African American. So teaching this to students, right? They on the one hand have a lived experience of sort of African American history, especially if you're teaching the African American history survey. But even our white students sort of understand, right, that there's these racial dynamics to American history. But at the same time, they come in with this frustration sometimes that in high school, they're just learning the basics, right? So that they're not getting past Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and that sort of Black History Month celebration style African American history. And so this is why, I really applaud all these teachers who are thinking about more complicated ways of teaching the civil rights movement. I think that can be really, I think your students will plug into it. It'll make it feel more real and relatable and less romantic. And that's important, right? Making civil rights history harder makes it better.
A tour of the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis and the Lorraine Motel would make this even more relatable and impactful. I had the good fortune of attending the Liberty Bowl in Memphis this past December, and we toured the museum, and it was, it was quite breathtaking and moving.
I agree.
Our history is so expansive. All most people know is MLK. They think it revolves around MLK, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Malcolm X, but it goes way, way, way. It's wide and deep.
If I would say that to everybody else, if you ever find yourself in Memphis, make it a priority in terms of what you're going to do when you're in Memphis, and you won't regret it. I've never met someone who said I went to the Civil Rights Museum and it was like, no one ever is. Everyone comes away moved by the experience, feel like they have a deeper appreciation of what happened. And of course, it's built into the Lorraine Motel where King was assassinated. So it ends on this sort of really moving and powerful note, as you're suggesting, Mr. Fallon. Thank you.